The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata, that realization is what is of utmost importance. And realization involves not just awakening, but bringing the awakening to life in our daily life. Yesterday, I shared something of the life of Ikkyu, the iconoclastic Zen monk, Japanese Zen monk, who was utterly dedicated to his practice, which is what it takes, really. And today I'd like to share with you something of the life of Eihei Dogen, who was 2 centuries, more or less, before, a little bit more than 2 centuries before Ikkyu, also Japanese monk, and credited with bringing Soto Zen to Japan, the Soto Zen sect. There were originally 5 sects of Zen in China, all coming out of the ways of teachings of different masters. And eventually, now in modern times, there are only 2 left, Soto and Rinzai. The others have either merged with one of the other sects or have simply not had any successors, and therefore the lineage is not carried on. But Dogen's lineage, the Soto Sect, is quite strong, and it is the majority sect of practice centers in America. Rinzai is a little bit different and comes out of China as well, much earlier China, and has a strong tradition of koan practice. The Soto Sect has done, and let's say it continues in some places to do, Zen koan work. However, it's not done in the same way as the Rinzai Zen koans are done. And Rinzai Zen koans, one needs to realize deeply enough the understanding of what the koan is trying to point to, that one can actually, as I said, bring it to life in your daily life. The koan system was developed as a way of helping people deepen practice. And it started many, many centuries ago in China. And most of the stories that combine to make the koan collections are actually of Chinese masters. There is only one koan collection that was put together in Japan, and that is known as the Kato Shu, or Entangling Vines and Creepers. If you've ever had to try to hike through a dense forest that was filled with entangling climbers and creepers, you know that it's not an easy task, and that is one of the side effects of trying to work on koans in the Rinzai system. In the Soto system, at least the way it has been done at the San Francisco Zen Center historically, is really more like a college class, background information on the masters and so on and so forth, and so many weeks on a koan. The account I saw many years ago was 2 weeks per koan. In Rinzai, one can work for years on a single koan. And traditionally in Rinzai, one works on a breakthrough koan, which is, there are just a handful of what are known as breakthrough koans. The most well-known one is Mu, or does a dog have the Buddha nature? And Joshu, whose monk asked him that, said Mu, or Wu. And the thing is, it was particularly puzzling because At one point in time, when Joshi was asked that question, he answered yes. A dog does have the Buddha nature, and then another time he answered no, a dog does not have the Buddha nature. And actually both are true, and this is why he could say yes or no, and be honest at each time. And that's the conundrum about that koan. How can something have and not have at the same time? Another breakthrough koan is the sound of one hand. We know what two hands can make, but what's the sound of one hand? And it requires stepping aside from our assumptions about things in order to solve that koan, which of course it requires stepping aside our assumptions of things to solve any koan. And another, which is one of my favorites, is show me your face before your parents were born. Show me your face before your parents were born. How can I have a face before even my parents were born? Well, that is your original nature. But that's not the answer to that koan. It has to be demonstrated, as the answer to any koan has to be. Koans are to bring the practice alive, to stretch our minds beyond our assumptions, beyond our conditioning, to see a deeper truth, a wider truth, an eternal truth that doesn't depend on cultural times or cultural influences. And this is the advantage of koans. They can take us profoundly deep, particularly if we do them in the Rinzai system. In the Soto system, as I understand it, and it is also my understanding, I was told by a Japanese master that the Soto Sect in Japan basically has quit using them officially. But they're still used because they're interesting, curious episodes. Does a dog have the Buddha nature? Isn't everything Buddha nature? Then if everything is Buddha nature, how can a dog be left out? And so on. And of course, that famous one, show me your face before your parents were born. At any rate, Dogen, back to Dogen, was born in 1200 in Kyoto, Japan. And he, like Ikkyu, and like so many of the Zen masters, had pain and suffering from the very beginning. His father, he was, as Ikkyu was, he was an illegitimate child of a high-ranking court person. And although his mother was not exiled, she actually died when he was only 7 or 8 years old, depending on the which calendar you look at. And his father supposedly died earlier, or at least his father disappeared, was not on scene. And I understand that his father did die earlier. And it's not spoken of in the Wikipedia account of Dogen's life, but my understanding as well is that he was adopted at 10 by an uncle, and was being primed to take over a courtly position. But instead, he ended up in a monastery not long after that as a young acolyte monk. And in those days in Japan, the Tendai sect, particularly in the Kyoto area, where Mount Hiei, which was sort of the headquarter temple area of the Tendai sect, was prominent. And Zen really was a very, very, very early, in its very earliest years in Japan. And it was in the 1100s that Zen masters came from China and taught Zen. So Dogen was initially in a Tendai monastery and learned the esoteric and exoteric practices of the Tendai sect. But he wasn't satisfied, as EQ also wasn't satisfied with the same teachings, basically. This says nothing about Tendai. It only says something about each of these men wanting to do something that would bring them to a different level of understanding. And they didn't feel that the Tendai practices were going to make it happen. And so Dogen trained, and then he eventually started practicing Zen. It's not clear exactly how he learned Zen practice, but he got in trouble as a Tendai monk for doing meditation, for practicing Zen meditation. And so then he hooked up with a Zen master who had been to China previously and was going back to China. And together they went to China, and Dogen spent 5 years there and practiced. And if you watch the Zen documentary of his life called Zen, it was put out by the Japanese and has English subtitles. It's a very inspiring documentary of Dogen's life, and it expresses his life as one of great compassion and deep understanding. So Dogen went to China. He tried different temples, different teachers, and finally found one that really was deep. And he did in the movie, it's kind of funny how it's portrayed, because it's kind of hooky, but he did have an enlightenment experience. Actually, apparently he had two. And one of the earlier Chan masters that he trained with actually was ready to sanction him, and he refused it, believing that apparently that he had not gone deeply enough. But eventually, when Rujing, the Chinese master Rujing, understood his awakening experience and said, yes, you've got it. Then, not long after that, Dogen returned to Japan. His Japanese companion had already died, but Dogen came back to Japan and was starting to teach Zen, but he kept getting in trouble with the Tendai sect that was trying to eradicate Zen, trying to monopolize the religious, spiritual practice of the era. And so Dogen left Kyoto and went elsewhere. And eventually he was supported by a high-ranking man who provided the land and the funds to build what is now known as Eihei Monastery. And so Dogen is sometimes called Dogen Kigen. Sometimes his name is Eihei Dogen, and that's where Eihei Monastery's name came from. And then there are many other names. And this is one of the challenges for anyone studying the history of Zen teachers, is that they often have multiple different names, so that they'll have an ordination name, and then they'll have a teaching name, and then they'll have another name or two, depending on their rank and whether somebody really high has authorized them to be a national teacher, and so on and so forth. So he has got a number of names, but we call him Dogen Kigen. The most important thing to know about Dogen was that he was deeply committed to zazen. And he felt that zazen was enlightenment. And in a way, he's correct. He felt that we are already enlightened, and therefore we do not need to get enlightenment. And in fact, that was a question that he had. That is what took him to China. Let's see if I can find it here. Both the exoteric and esoteric school of Buddhism, Tendai. In Tendai, they maintain that human beings are endowed with Dharma nature by birth. Actually, we're endowed by, we're not endowed, we can't not have it. If this is the case, why did the Buddha of all Buddhas of all ages, undoubtedly the possession of enlightenment, find it necessary to seek enlightenment and engage in spiritual practices? So why, if we're already enlightened, do we have to sit zazen? And he couldn't find his answers in the Tendai sect, and that's what took him to China. And eventually, his awakening experience was known as dropping body and mind. And apparently his teacher, Rujing, had said to him, drop body and mind. There are things called turning words that if a student is ripe, the teacher can say at a particular moment in confronting the student, and it causes the student to suddenly break out of their traditional way of thinking and assuming things into a deeper level of understanding. They don't need to be words necessarily. There is a koan involving a student who was perplexed about something and went to see his teacher, and he talked with the teacher trying to sort things out for quite a long time, and it grew dark. And the teacher finally said, it's getting late. It's time for you to go. And the student opened the door to the quarters and saw that it was dark and said, oh, it's dark out, implying that he was going to have a hard time stumbling his way back to wherever it was he was trying to stay. So the teacher lit a candle, handed it to him, and as soon as the student grasped it, the teacher blew out the flame, and that brought about a deep awakening experience. There are stories of students having awakening experience through sound and through sight. There was a monk who, in desperation, feeling that he would never amount to anything in a monastery, finally decided that he would take care of the grave of an ancient master that had fallen into disrepair. And so he went and he spent some years, and he was obviously searching deeply within for the answer to his question, which wasn't necessarily posed, but he was sweeping the area around the tomb when a piece of broken tile hit a bamboo, and with that tuck sound, he had an awakening experience. There's another story of a student who was awakened on seeing peach blossoms. And then, of course, there is Hakuin, who had his first of many awakening experiences, um, hearing the sound of a bell, a temple bell, and another experience when he was deeply absorbed in his koan. And this is when he was with Dokyo Eitan, his real teacher, and he was out doing takohatsu, trying to receive food so he could survive, because Dokyo Eitan did not have money or resources to support any students, and so anybody who came to him for training had to go out and support themselves. And so Dogen was in the nearby village and doing takohatsu, which is where you go around in Japan. The traditional way is you go along a road, and when you come to a dwelling place or a business place, you put your hands in gasho and you chant. And what we chanted at Sogenji was translated as Dharma, Ho. Only we didn't do it like that. I don't want to blast you out of the Zendo here, so I won't do it the way we did it there. But he was doing that, and he was so absorbed in his koan. He was standing in front of a home, and the old woman who lived in the home was annoyed with all this sound, and she tried to get him to go away, but he was, again, so absorbed in his koan that he wasn't paying attention to what was outside. And so she came after him and started whacking him with a broom and actually knocked him out. He fell in the mud, but as he was so caught by surprise, he was plunged into an awakened mind state. And what happened was he fell into the mud, and a passersby came to his rescue and was helping him up. And the man said, "That old lady sure knocked your lights out, didn't she?" And at that point, Hakuin just burst out laughing, and everybody ran away because they thought he was nuts. But I diverge. So Ru Jing could see that Dogen was close, and so he said, "Drop body and mind." And suddenly it happened. And Dogen said, "Body and mind dropped body and mind." And he later said, to study the way, in other words, to practice Zen, is to study the self. And to study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be enlightened by the 10,000 things. And to be enlightened by the 10,000 things is to remove the barriers between self and other. When we can let go our normal view of life, of people, of things, of activities, and recognize that there is no separation among us, and let go to the point where that is a real experience for us, depending on how deep that experience goes, we have had an awakening experience, and it changes our life. Again, as I've said so many times, and needs to be said many times, a single awakening experience is not sufficient normally, and it's not sufficient in particular if it's not integrated into your daily life, because we have an understanding that can take place, but our habit patterns of greed, anger, and delusion sort of roll out like a tsunami does before it comes roaring back in. And like a tsunami, all those old habit patterns come roaring back in, and then we are faced with a choice. We can either admit, acknowledge, feel the remorse that comes from seeing our past behavior more clearly, and therefore begin the process naturally of changing. It's not something we can try to do. It's something that it essentially requires seeing where we are dysfunctional and feeling how that feels. The regret, the remorse, the wish not to do it ever again. And when that is deep enough, it begins to weaken the habit pattern. And we continue practicing, and the thing comes up again, but not as strong. And then we have another choice. We can ignore it, and it will just kind of go underground and pull our strings, regardless of what we do. It'll be operating in the background. Or we can, again, accept it, open to it, experience how it feels. And in that experiencing, the letting go takes place. This is why this practice of welcoming the felt sense, of experiencing the felt sense, how it feels in our body, not just when we've awakened to some dysfunctional habit pattern, but all the time, is essential to living a full life, a full and fulfilling life. But normal human beings from a very early age on attempt to just experience the happy part and to deny or shut down the not so happy part. And I don't know a single human being that grows up without any challenging experiences. And depending on how sensitive we are, they will result in our trying to deal with it by shutting down, shutting out, closing down. And that is known as dissociation. And what it is it's sort of turning ourselves into not quite a zombie, but more robotic, not feeling. We can still function fairly well, but we don't really feel because we don't want to feel. And if we don't want to feel the difficult stuff, it's very difficult to feel the really wonderful stuff. You can't shut down part of your mind and keep the other part of your mind open. We can't pick and choose what experiences we're going to accept. And so what is most beneficial is, of course, to accept whatever comes along, as Mitra-roshi famously said, simply to receive whatever comes. His deep awakening experience brought him to realize that all he had to do was receive what came to him, and everything would turn out. And that is the case. We try to manipulate, we try to control, we try to only feel certain kinds of things, we try to do only certain kinds of things, we try to have relationships that are only certain kinds of relationships, always happy. That's not life. Life is a tapestry, a marvelous, fascinating tapestry of positive and negative. And when we are willing to feel the whole thing, to receive what comes towards us, then there are no barriers to responding in the most appropriate ways to whatever it is that has come to us. And Dogen, in a certain way, nailed that when he said to study the path or the way, the Buddha way, is to study the self. We're learning about, we're experiencing who we are, what our foibles are, what our experiences are through the felt sense. And when we tune in ever completely, over and over and over again, become absorbed in this experience of life, then we forget who we are. Who we think we are is this self-image that we hold up sort of in front of us as a picture of who we want to be. And it has some accuracy sometimes and a lot of inaccuracy the rest of the time. And it's not real. It's a picture. Who we really are is real. And what is that? To explore that is to forget that picture. And to forget that picture is to suddenly become awakened at the sound of the bell or the sight of a peach blossom, or as Ikkyu did, the caw of a crow. And then, of course, to integrate it into our daily life. This practice is just amazing. It frees us so phenomenally if we are willing to walk in with open arms and to deal with the boredom, the frustration, the excitement, the highs and the lows that come with practice, the disenchantment that can come by feeling that feeling. Whatever comes up, to open our arms and offer it radical acceptance such that we don't have to like it, but this is how it feels right now. So, all right, let's really explore how it really does feel right now. And when we do that, there are no barriers. And we can move forward with freedom and positive effectiveness, really, no matter what the situation. This is what Dogen has been teaching us. He's done a lot of writing. He was very literary, and some of that writing is still, I think, pretty much all of it is still extant, and most of it is translated into English. But reading his words is not going to get us awakening. It may give us some insight into his way of thinking about things, perhaps, but it's not going to free us. He was right on. Zazen is what will free us. And those of us who are listening to this Teisho at some level want to be free. So there's your recipe. Tune in, search deeply, by experiencing with a big question mark, and you don't know what the answer is. Just like Dogen. If we're endowed from the very beginning with the Buddha nature, why did all the Buddhas of space and time practice zazen and come to awakening? I'll leave that for all of you to ponder. But the most important thing is to extend that out breath, letting go, trying to hold on to things, feeling your way through the process of breathing out and breathing in with that unspoken question mark, that openness to possibility, that if you do this long enough and deeply enough, meaning really absorb yourself in it. And this is a process that is not instantly attained. This is something that we learn how to do. Just like many, many things. We learned how to read. We learned how to write. We learned how to ride a bicycle. Whatever we learned how to do, it didn't happen instantaneously. You didn't just hop on that bike and immediately ride off. The bike fell over. I remember one of my kids, they were both the kids, when we returned from living in Thailand, were given bicycles by their grandparents, and we lived in countries where they didn't have access to kids' bikes, and so this was a new experience for them. And my younger son, one day I was watching him ride by, and he threw himself off the bike. He had not learned yet how to stop the bike. And so his solution was to go to where he wanted to be and then throw himself off the bike. And the bike kept going, of course, but eventually, yes, he did learn how to stop the bike. But zazen is not a quick and dirty practice. It's an exploration of who we really are. And if we persist long enough and deeply enough with enough commitment and faith, willing to ride out the dry periods, willing to ride out the difficult things, we'll be rewarded. So thank you for listening. We'll stop now, recite the 4 vows.